At first glance, line might seem a simple matter, but as you begin to look more closely, it reveals a surprising degree of complexity. There are quite a number of choices to make when using line, and there's a great deal of art involved in making those choices. So far, we've talked about three kinds of line: contour, cross-contour, and construction line. Now we'll dig deeper. We'll learn about the attributes of line that directly bear on its functions and expressive potential. And we'll also learn about a new kind of line, gestural line. Here are three drawings we've looked at before: the Holbein, the Schiele, and this Rembrandt. Each one's primarily a line drawing of multiple figures, but in each case, line is used in a somewhat different way. We'll take a close look at these drawings, as well as several others, to help us understand how and why artists use different kinds of line. You'll need pencils, erasers, sharpening tools, and brush and ink. You'll also need some 8.5 by 11-inch paper or a medium-sized sketchbook. Edgar Degas not only drew, painted, and made sculpture, but also wrote poetry. He was once speaking to the poet Stéphane Mallarmé and said, "Your métier, your field, is hellishly difficult. I'm never able to really get at what I'm going for, and yet I'm so full of ideas." Mallarmé responded, "My dear Degas, one doesn't make poetry out of ideas. You make poems out of words." And this applies to drawing too. As we've noted, we can't really draw a person sitting in a room. We can only draw lines that create the illusion of a person sitting in a room. And we can accomplish this with many different types of lines. Many people beginning to draw, though, often have trouble even seeing the lines. That's because they're so intent on what the lines construct: fruit in a still life, trees in a landscape, or a model on a model stand. To bring the point home, here's a detail of a drawing. Unlikely you'd be able to tell me what it is, but clearly these are marks on a surface. They're medium gray lines on a neutral orange paper. Neutral orange means it's like an orange, but the saturation or orangeness is tuned down a bit. Here's the drawing in its entirety. It's the Schiele. The personality of the figures is so present that it can be difficult to even see beyond that illusion. Many people wouldn't even pay attention to the lines themselves. But if we do, it becomes evident that the drawing's constructed of some very particular lines, and these lines actually account for the way the drawing feels. The kinds of lines used has everything to do with the drawing's expressive quality. Going back to Degas and Mallarmé, we can't really make a neck, shoulder, or arm. We can only make lines which, in the aggregate, suggest specific physical form. And the way those lines are inflected, the visual attributes of the various lines, has a lot to do with the feel of the drawing. Schiele's drawing exemplifies many major attributes of line, and we're going to talk about 9. The first is value. That refers to how light or dark a line is. Next, width. That refers to how thin or thick. Continuity. That'll refer to how continuous or discontinuous a line is. Length. How long or short. Direction. That'll refer to how horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. Shape. That refers to qualities like straight, angular, and curvilinear. Degree of closure. Lines run the range from straight with no closure to those that curve and fully close in on themselves, making a shape. Speed. You can draw a line quickly, slowly, or any place in between, and this will really affect the way they look. Lastly, texture. Lines can have textural qualities from smooth to rough. Let's start with value. When we speak about value, we're referring to the lightness or darkness of a line. Here, some lines are light, and some are much darker. In fact, there's a range of line value throughout the drawing. In addition, some line segments shift from light to dark or vice versa. There are two major ways to control line value. The first involves pencil choice. Take out your softest pencil, the highest B number, and also your hardest pencil, the highest H number. Make a line with each. As we noted in an earlier lecture, the B produces a darker line than the H. Now, the other factor affecting line value is pressure. Again, using both your softest and the hardest pencil, exert the least amount of pressure possible and produce a line. Then up the pressure. The line's going to get dependably darker. The softer the pencil, the greater the range of value. The harder, the less range you have. So experiment with that full range of pencils. Following Sheila's example, try drawing a range of lines from light to dark. And then try moving from light to dark and dark to light in a single line. Next, there's line width. Some lines in the drawing are comparatively thin, while others are thicker, and we see some segments shift from thin to thick. There are three main ways to control this. The first is, once again, pressure. More pressure, thicker. Less pressure, thinner. In fact, as you up the pressure earlier, you likely noticed an increase in width as well as darkness. As with line value, as far as pressure is concerned, the softer the pencil, the greater the range of widths. So try this with a couple of your pencils to get a feel for how they behave. The second factor is how the pencil comes into contact with the page. We can control this by how we hold the pencil. With a pointed pencil, holding it like a writing implement, we get a fine line. By twisting it so that the side comes into contact with the page, we get a thicker line. As we saw in an earlier lecture, another factor is how we sharpen our pencils. We can expose more of the graphite with a utility knife, then shape the pencil into a wedge shape on our sanding block, and this will give us a sharp edge for thin lines and a flat wedge for thicker ones. This makes it much easier to flow from thin to thick by simply rotating the pencil between thumb and first finger. And we could equally blunt our pencil on our sanding block to get a dependably thicker line without increasing pressure. Now you're ready to draw lines of varying width and value. Try thin lines that are light, medium, and dark. Now try the same on the thick side, light, medium, and dark. Now try to get a thickness between your thin and thick line and repeat with three different values, light, medium, and dark. Next, move gradually from thin to thick and back again. Now try to do this while also moving light to dark, and then dark to light. Let's take another look at this detail. Notice the line that moves from the upper right down at a diagonal and then turns 90 degrees and cuts down at a diagonal in the opposite direction. You'll likely have a sense how Sheila went about this. Start more on the point or sharp edge for the thin segment, then rotate to the side or wedge for the thicker one. You can also see how he's changed pressure. Note the slight dig right after the change of direction. These first two factors, line value and width, are often taken together and referred to as line weight. The greater the line weight, the greater the contrast to the page. And all else being equal, the part of the drawing with the greatest line weight will function as a focal point and draw the viewer's eye to that section. This is a primary means for creating a hierarchy in a line drawing. So in this sense, line weight functions compositionally. And this is an abstract visual phenomenon. It has nothing to do with what you're drawing. It applies to everything. Here's a thin, light diagonal line. It attracts your eye and becomes a focal point because it's the only thing on an otherwise blank page. Now, let's add another diagonal line, but a bit darker and thicker. You'll note that your eye goes to the new line first. Now I'll make another line and increase the weight. The focal point predictably shifts. We'll add one more line, darker and thicker yet. We have 4 distinct line weights, and they direct you to move through the drawing in a particular order. Artists apply this principle routinely. Let's say I want you to go to the apple in the still life first, the bowl second, the pattern drape third, and the table and wall fourth. One way to achieve this is to stack my line weights. This functions the way relative volume does in music. We'll generally pay more attention to the wailing guitar above the accompanying keyboards and drums, or the trumpets in the high range above the accompanying violins. You can think about line weight as visual volume. The reason that this works is that it's precisely the way we see. We've already noted that when we focus on something, we see more of its detail. Additionally, when we focus on something, say me, as the camera's doing now, my value contrast is high relative to Jamie, my producer, behind me. But if the camera's focus is on Jamie behind me, my contrasts go down. When we focus our eyes on something, its value, contrast, and edge definition increases. We can create just this visual sensation by manipulating our line weights on the page. In Sheila's drawing, some of the highest value contrasts are located in both the model's and Sheila's eyes. And that's a good choice because the drawing's all about looking. She's posing in the mirror, checking herself out, appears to be quite pleased with what she sees. And he's deeply involved in studying her. He's knitting his brows, pursing his lips, and trying to make drawing sense out of what he's seeing. Through the use of value, we're made to look at them looking. Abstraction orchestrates the narrative. Our next factor is continuity. Some lines are discontinuous or fragmented, and some artists refer to these as implied lines, while other lines are continuous. We can relate continuity and discontinuity to focus, too. Highly continuous lines present things in sharp focus. That's because when we focus in on something, its edges appear clear. When we see something out of focus, say in our peripheral vision, its edges appear somewhat broken. Discontinuous line can create just this sensation. Take a look at the long continuous line moving down the model's rib cage, and also down her pelvis and thigh. Compare Sheila's arm and elbow. The long continuous line creates a sensation of focus. In contrast, Sheila's arm and elbow are drawn as if we're seeing them in our peripheral vision. In fact, the way the model's right arm fades out and the line breaks up a bit below her right hip echoes the breaking up in Sheila's elbow. It's as if his visions focus into the center of the drawing where we get our greatest accumulation of long continuous lines. Picasso's portrait of Apollinaire represents another great example of contrasting line weights and continuous versus discontinuous line. Apollinaire is mostly drawn in robust weights and continuous line, but when we get to the shelf and the objects behind him, the line becomes lighter, thinner, and discontinuous. This cements our focus on Apollinaire and also fosters the illusion of spatial depth. Greater line weight and continuous line will create focal zones, and all else being equal, tend to pull forward in space. Lighter, thinner, and discontinuous lines will receive less of the eye's attention and will, all else being equal, recede into space. Related to continuity and discontinuity is line length. In the Sheila, we find line segments that are relatively short and others that are relatively long. Varying line lengths can be used to create rhythm in a drawing, just as in music where varied durations or lengths of notes create audible rhythm. Here we can create visual rhythm. Here are some lines of different lengths. Can you feel the rhythm? It's almost audible. I base the example on the William Bailey still life. So this not only applies to line length, but measure in general. Can you feel the rhythm in the objects? Another factor affecting line is direction and stability. As we noted earlier, horizontals are stable at rest, verticals less so, and diagonals the most dramatic. In the Sheila, a dramatic drawing to be sure, there are few horizontals to speak of. We find the greatest degree of horizontality in the woman's reflected head. And indeed, this is the place of rest in the drawing. The remainder of the drawings, all verticals and diagonals, makes things feel dynamic. Contrast that with a Bailey. It's peaceful, at rest. The format shapes a stable horizontal to Sheila's gangly vertical. And, not surprisingly, it's full of repeated horizontals, no dramatic diagonals to speak of. Another factor affecting line is the shape quality of the line. Here we have lines that are relatively straight. Others are angular, and others curvilinear and flowing. Overall, there's a much greater reliance on straight and angular lines in the Sheila self-portrait and a much greater use of curvilinear line in the female figure. This functions to create contrast between them and express their different characters, male versus female, artist versus model. Related to a line's shape is its degree of closure. Some lines here are very open. They make no move toward closure. Other lines or sets of lines close and make clearly delineated shapes. Others yet exhibit some degree of closure. They begin to suggest shape but don't fully close in on themselves. Next, there's the attribute of speed. Lines are imbued with character by how they're actually made. Here, some were clearly drawn very quickly, while others were drawn much more slowly. Though it's not functioning prominently in this drawing, we can also speak about line texture. This is often the product of the way the line interacts with a paper surface. A smooth surface will give us smooth lines, lines that are consistent in value both internally and along the line's edges, like the lines in the Sheila. But a textured paper, one with a noticeable tooth, like many charcoal or watercolor papers, will give us rougher lines, lines with irregularities both internally and along their edges. That is, unless we apply significant pressure to get the drawing material into the recessed parts of the surface. And we're going to speak more about this factor when we talk about texture later on. Overall, you can think about these 9 attributes like sliding scales. We can increase or decrease any of these factors and make a pretty unlimited number of line types by combining diverse attributes. For instance, we could make a thick, light, short, straight line drawn slowly with a lot of texture. Or we could make a dark, thin, long, curved line drawn quickly and smoothly. Or we could do this last line again, but shift gradually from very light to very dark along the line's length, applying greater pressure as we went. Like I said, it gets complicated pretty quickly. And we're not even talking about drawing objects, just lines in the abstract. It's a lot like the range of choices you have when you play a note. For each note, there's a duration, attack, and dynamics among other variables. For instance, you could play a given pitch as a 16th note or a whole note, and you could also play it legato or staccato, and pianissimo or fortissimo. And these, among many other choices, affect the way we hear the pitches being played. In the end, all of this contributes an enormous amount to the way we experience the music emotionally. We also affect line attributes by our choice of materials. Different tools and papers or surfaces have different intrinsic qualities and personalities that will create different opportunities and limitations. And we're going to learn more about this later. We can also affect the attributes of line by how we physically draw. To test this out, try drawing by only moving your fingers, then only your wrist, then arm, then your shoulder. You'll see that each of these choices can affect the lines you draw, and that can be compounded by how you hold the drawing implement and by the decision to sit or stand. These discussions lead us to our final topic, gestural line. If we go back to Sheila's drawing and look at the wiggly line describing the sloping part of the model's hat, or the lines describing Sheila's arm, we would classify these lines as gestural. Rather than trying to find the specific boundaries and edges of objects or planes, gestural line describes the approximate location and character of things. It generally has the attribute of speed and some quality of wildness, much less sober and orderly than the kind of contour or cross-contour we've seen in Eakins or Holbein. To get a better sense of this, let's take a look at the Holbein in relationship to Rembrandt. Both drawings are largely line drawings. Both depict a group of people, but Holbein and Rembrandt are using line very differently. How long do you think it took to make the Holbein? Gotta be hours. And the Rembrandt? I'd say minutes. In the Holbein, the figures are clearly countable. 10 in the front room, 2 in the back. In the Rembrandt, not so clear. As we move from that central grouping to the far right and left, well, just hard to say. If I zoom in on just about any detail in the Holbein, it's pretty clear what's being depicted. If I do the same in the Rembrandt, much less clear. The lines are more abstract, they're more scribbled. They don't necessarily hew to objects or parts of objects. They're certainly removed from the idea of outlining. Different kinds of drawings have different utilities, different goals or purposes, and different approaches solve different kinds of drawing problems. Artists choose to draw one way or another depending on the type of problem they're trying to solve. In this drawing of Jesus among the doctors, Rembrandt's trying to figure out a composition, his format shape, and his object-around relationships. He wants to identify where things are and about how large they are, one relative to the other. But for this, he doesn't need a lot of detail in the figures, or drapery, or environment. He wants a quick and ready, all-encompassing drawing language, one that'll allow him to move through multiple compositional permutations, multiple drawings in rapid succession. Our first compositional ideas are not always our best. Let's say I want to move through 5, 10, or 15 different compositional ideas for a given drawing. Adopting Holbein's language would consume all my time. But if I could work through my ideas using Rembrandt's language, well, it'd be a real time saver. Once having found a strong compositional structure, I might then study all the specifics in a drawing like Holbein's. While many people grasp that drawing is about expression, to get to that expression, we may use drawing as a problem-solving tool. And a primary problem is to identify a winning composition. There are other reasons why artists choose a gestural approach. Not everything stays still. Clouds in the sky, passengers on a train, boxers in a ring, they're all in motion. Many things you may want to draw will be too. Working from observation, we don't always have the luxury of drawing slowly. So we need to develop an approach that allows us to note things quickly. Let's take a look at a couple more examples of gesture drawing. You've likely seen Sargent's painting Madame X. This is a drawing of the same woman. And here's a Delacroix. And this by Daumier, one of the greats associated with gestural line. In each case, you'll notice the wildness and speed of the lines, the small marks and bits of line associated with longer line segments, and often the multiple lines that result in the approximate definition of edges and changes of plane. What Holbein does involves a great deal of skill and artistry, but the approach, using contour and cross-contour, comes pretty naturally to most people. On the other hand, what these artists are doing, gesture, that can be hard to get at first. Students often struggle with it because it's just so different than following the edges and plane changes in objects in a linear way. But give it a shot, there's nothing to lose, just pencil and paper. To get started, let's return to basic shapes. Pull out your first contour drawings, the ones of the circle, square, and triangle. These are more or less in Holbein language. We'll use them as models with the goal of translating Holbein into Rembrandt, to the language of gesture. Let's start with that circle. First, in preparation, without drawing anything, let your eyes flit around all over the drawing, from the circle's perimeter across its width, quickly moving back and forth and up and down, as if your eyes were like a fly darting back and forth over a pie at a picnic. Now, while your eyes continue to move rapidly over your prior drawing, let your pencil begin to flit above the surface of your new sheet of paper, tracking your eyes. The pencil should move across the intended circle shape like an electron around the nucleus of an atom. We're at the top, we're at the bottom, we're at the side, skipping across its diameter. At this point, begin to touch down on the paper, first on the right, then the left, then towards the top or bottom. We might even leave some bits of line in the middle of our circle as we feel the distance from one side to the other. We're getting in touch with its measure. Each time we touch down on the page, we leave a bit of line. In the aggregate, it defines a set of approximations of where we think the edge of our circle might be. Let's take this one more step. And it's already suggested by some of the internal marks, bits of cross contour. Let's use more of these internal lines so that we can transform the flat circle into a three-dimensional sphere. A useful way to think about gesture is that it combines the work that contour, cross-contour, and even construction line each do separately. And it's doing all of this efficiently, much more rapidly than you could do it with contour, cross-contour, and construction line separately. But the emphasis is on approximation, not certainty. We're finding the shape of what we're drawing. That matches up with contour's function. We're diagramming its measure, pulling our pencil across its height and width. That's a construction line function. And we're creating the illusion of its three-dimensionality with interior markings. We can even suggest further three-dimensionality by drawing the interior, drawing through as it's called, as if our object were transparent. That's the cross-contour function. One of the common hallmarks of gesture drawing are small marks or bits of line that don't really appear to be attached to anything. I understand these as probing marks, as initial attempts at locating the edge of a form. But as the drawing progresses, the artist gains greater confidence about the location of visual events. and longer line segments appear above or below or to the right or the left of those initial marks. Now that you've drawn a sphere with gesture, try it with your rectangle and triangle. Follow the same steps, then add adjacent planes and turn the rectangle into a block, the triangle into a pyramid. It's going to take some practice to get this going, so take out a dozen of your earlier contour and cross-contour still life drawings, the figure ground or compositional drawings you did. Using the same method we just used, translate these drawings into gesture drawings. And try this with brush and ink. It'll feel a little less comfortable at first, but because it's a less familiar tool, one you can't really control like a pencil, you'll be less likely to use it in a contour-like way. It will help you get a grasp of drawing with gesture or line. Start with a fairly dry brush. Dip the brush's tip into the ink and dry some off. You should get a light gray mark. Knowing you can't erase will push you to search out the approximate position of things with bits of line rather than continuous line. You want to be skipping over the surface, quickly flitting back and forth across a page, not moving sequentially along a line. Your goal is to find approximate positions, directions, and amounts through a series of repeated tests and probes. Think about gesture as an all-encompassing type of line. You want your bits of line and mark to note what your construction lines, armature lines, and the lines defining your large ground shapes would have done in past drawings. You want to note the large aggregate shape of your objects. And this is very important. You want to measure the negative shapes between your objects with your probing gestural marks and lines. Gesture can do all of this at once. It will help you out to do these drawings with a timer, 2 minutes each. Once you've done some gestural drawings based on your earlier drawings, try this directly from life too. Set up 3 simple objects on your still life table. Think about their aggregate shape as you set them up. Next, frame them in your viewfinder. With a light H pencil, draw the format shape on your page. Then put aside the pencil in the viewfinder and with brush and ink, do a 2-minute drawing. Here's a helpful technique. Some refer to it as rehearsal drawing or phantom drawing. The idea is this. Before actually drawing, close one eye and hold your finger or brush out over the subject. Then do a gesture drawing in the air to familiar yourself with where things are and with the relationship among the objects, the ground, and the negative shapes, and also the space they will sit in. You're probing and searching for visual data. Where does the drawing begin and end? What would the format shape be like? Where's the large division? Where's the back of the table meet the wall? What's the farthest point to the right? Where does the farthest point to the left of the aggregate shape? What's the farthest point up? What's the farthest point down? What are the negative shapes like between the objects? How far do we have to travel from one side to the other? What are the widths of the objects? Their heights? Once you've done your phantom drawing, set the timer. This time give yourself 1 minute to do each drawing. Use little bits of line at first, small light marks, mere approximations. You're giving yourself positioning marks in answer to the questions we're asking about where things occur and where they don't. Absence and presence are equally important. As you begin to be more certain of the locations, use a bit more pressure, a darker and somewhat more continuous line. When you're ready, try gesture drawing with more challenging subjects. Try the interior of your home or other building. Try a landscape or cityscape. Draw while watching TV, and this is really great practice because the scene is constantly shifting. It pushes you towards speed. Same with drawing at a playground or at a sporting event or on the subway. Any situation where the world is not standing still for you. All these experiences will help you expand your abilities with gesture. As you do this more and more, you'll find your own natural handwriting and calligraphy. I see it with my students all the time. It just takes some persistence. Next, we'll expand our understanding of how artists think compositionally. And very soon, we're going to be putting all these pieces together to make a very complex drawing.